Hello and welcome to Colred Plays Raid Shadow Legends. I am Colred. Thank you for joining me. In today's video, we are going to be covering the Hydra Clan Boss. Now, the Hydra Clan Boss can be a bit intimidating to get into, especially for newer players. It's definitely geared as more of an end game fight, but that doesn't mean that you can't start getting value in the early and in the mid game. So if you have never dived into Hydra Clan Boss, or if you have tried it and backed away because it just seems too intimidating, we're going to go over the fight today. This is not going to be a full and absolute complete guide on everything Hydra. It would take several hours of videos to do all of that. But I'm going to give you the basics, the fundamentals you're going to need to know in order to understand what the fight is about, and also what you might want to consider when building your first Hydra Clan Boss team, or if you're trying to level up to a new difficulty of Hydra Clan Boss, what you might want to look out for there. I'm not going to be covering team compositions in their entirety. I'm not going to even be covering a lot of champions in their entirety. This is just about understanding what's going on in the fight and kind of beginning to chip away at that mystery, that intimidating wall of information that is the clan boss, the Hydra Clan Boss fight. So if this sounds like a good video for you, if you could do me a favor and right now go ahead and drop a like, consider subscribing to the channel. That would help me out. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's go ahead and dive into our guide. So the reason we're actually mentioning this today is because we do have this new aspect of Hydra Clan Boss, which is the Hydra Clash. So I'm going to cover this. It'll take a minute and then we'll move on. Basically, what's going to happen is every week there will be 5 clans that are grouped together and will compete for additional rewards based on Clan Boss. So what happens here is your first key on each difficulty is going to count towards your clan's total damage. And then basically whichever clan does the most damage is going to be ranked, at the top, and the next amount of damage, so on and so forth, all the way down. The top 3 clans will be in for rewards, and you will gain personal rewards based on how much you've actually damaged the Hydra Clan Boss. You can see as long as you do 35 million, you have a chance to get 1 chest, and then all the way up to 650 millions, you can get more impressive chests. I'm not sure if you just get the highest chest. That's probably the way it works because all of the other clan boss rewards generally just reward the highest chest. But even if you get 3rd place, if your clan gets 3rd place and you clear 35 million personally, you will get a chest there. Now that is going to be something that probably newer players aren't even going to be worried about, but it's a nice additional reason to get motivated to use your 3 Hydra keys every week. In a lot of cases, once you get Mithrala, you just kind of lose interest in Hydra Clan Boss. However, if you are a newer player, Mithrala is a huge motivating factor for why you want to go into Hydra Clan Boss in the first place. So if we go over here, you can see I'm just going to go to the rewards, and you can pick the lowest chest here, the novice chest, and you'll see that, oh, well, it doesn't show on this account because I already have Mithrala, but Mithrala shards would be dropping here. You can get 1 to 2 per week from this chest. So remember, this is just like Clan Boss. If your clan clears an entire difficulty level, so if normal is completely wiped off the map, then everybody who has contributed will get twice their number of chests. So whether you get the novice chest, you'll get 2 of those, or if you get the warrior chest, you could get 2 of those. So whatever chest you qualify for, you can get double that chest if your clan clears that entire difficulty level. So that means you can get up to 4 Mithrala fragments from just 1 chest. Again, you can also do multiple difficulties, but obviously you're going to start with the easiest one, which is the normal difficulty level. Now, something to know about this fight, there are a couple of things that are different than the normal clan boss fight. And the first is that you only get 3 keys per week instead of a key every 6 hours. So you want to plan when you are going to spend your time, when you're going to actually activate those keys and try to do some Hydra Clan Boss fights. Sometimes this fight is best performed or best fought with you present. This is not something you necessarily want to just full auto battle. You're going to want to watch this fight. You're going to want to try to manipulate this fight to some extent. And you can also reset this fight very easily. So one of the nice things about the Hydra Clan Boss fight is if I go in here and I battle this, I'm just going to go ahead and start this fight. And let's say I didn't like the way this fight was going. I could stop it in the middle, or I could stop it at the end. but let's go ahead and take one turn and say, ah, she didn't land her debuffs. She did, obviously, but Mithrala didn't land her debuffs. I don't like that start. I can just go over here to free regroup. Don't click end battle. That will use your key. But if you go to free regroup, you'll notice I'm back here and I still have 3 out of 3 keys. So it is a forgiving clan boss in some ways. You can practice all week if you want. You can use hundreds of battles. You can use hundreds of keys that you never commit to, and then you can back out, figure out your best team composition for the end of the week, and then commit your keys. So this is actually something that it's great that Plarium did this and allowed us to be able to practice this more, because obviously instead of using potentially 25 or 28 keys or even 30 keys a week like we do on Clan Boss, we're only getting 3. So this allows us just more time in there to see the fight, to see how our team compositions do, and to practice. One important thing to know is that each champion can only be used on 1 key per week. So if you use a champion in a fight and you accept the result of that fight and that key gets consumed, now that champion is locked out from the other keys for that week until the reset. So if you want to use all 3 keys on Hydra Boss, you're going to need 18 different champions to make up your 3 teams. So that leads us into the fight itself. Now, the first thing that we need to talk about probably is the fact that there are multiple heads here. You're always going to be fighting 4 heads, and the 4 heads on this page are the 4 on the left. And then when you've got these little 2 arrows, that's telling you that these other 2 heads can be swapped in at a later time. Now, basically, it's a 4 boss fight, a 4 enemy fight. We'll go back in here. And you can see we've got 4 heads. Now the heads all have their descriptions up top. So if you don't know the names or you don't know the pictures on site, you can look at them. You can look at all the skills here. There is also a full explanation. If you just want to hit the info tab in the previous screen, you can get a full description of the fight. But I'm just going to walk you through the 6 heads and what you need to know about them. Now, first of all, at normal, you're going to get 4 heads, and then there are 2 heads that are like substitute heads in reserve. When you kill a head, it isn't dead permanently. It just gets decapitated, and then it will regrow. And it may regrow the same head, or it may regrow one of the substitute heads. So let's say here I have the head of decay. If I kill the head of decay, I can get the head of decay back, or I can get one of the 2 heads that are the substitute heads. Okay, so you have basically, you would think of it as a 1 in 3 chance of getting the head of decay back, but at normal, you're almost guaranteed to get the same heads back over and over again. They can swap, but I don't actually remember it ever happening. So it may be a very, very small percentage, or there may be no chance at normal. But as you go up in difficulty, it becomes more and more likely for a substitute head to jump in. And the reason is that changes the fight and what your team needs to do. So once you get up to the higher difficulty levels, your team needs to be even more versatile than it is at normal. Okay, so now let's talk about the mechanics of the fight. We will get to the heads, I promise. We'll talk about all of the heads. I'm not going to do a deep dive into all of the heads, but I will give you the major talking points so you have an idea of, what you have to put into your team composition. So one thing you may notice right away is that my ninja has this like red jaw. It doesn't even look like a debuff, but it's a symbol. It is kind of a debuff with a 20 counter on it. So in 20 turns, ninja will be devoured. One of the heads will eat my ninja. Okay. Now that's bad for me, obviously, because he's one of my damage dealers. And I don't want him off the board. This is not a removable debuff. You can't get rid of it. You can't really avoid it in too many ways. There's one maybe way that you could avoid it, which is if he dies for any reason, that devour buff or debuff or whatever it is will jump to somebody else. Okay. And it will be reset. And then you could revive him. So that is something that you could do. You could let him die and revive him if you don't want him to be devoured. Now, when he's devoured, what will happen is one of these heads will swallow him, and then they'll get a bulge in their neck. You'll literally see that the snake head gets fat. Okay, so you'll know where it is. In addition, part of the red bar, the health bar, will turn green. Your team's job is now to eliminate this green health bar. If you can eliminate the green health bar, the Hydra will spit the champion back out into your team, and then they'll be part of your squad again and keep going. Devour will then move to a different champion. it always starts with the champion with the highest crit damage. So it's targeting your most dangerous damage dealers. But the same champion can never be devoured twice in a row. So it will move around, and there'll usually be 3 champions that get targeted: your highest, your second highest, and your third highest, depending on how many times you actually go through this process. Now, if you fail to rescue a devoured champion in 5 turns, that champion will be swallowed and will no longer be able to be rescued. So at that point, it is consumed and it is gone, or digested. I don't know the term that they use. I think it's digested, but that champion is gone. So we have a Devour debuff. The action, the attack is called consuming, and then digesting means they're wiped out of the board, and they can't be revived. So you have no way to bring them back. They are gone permanently for the rest of the fight. So a big part of this fight is going to be managing this particular mechanic. You want to make sure that you're killing or attacking the heads that have devoured your champions. And remember, you only get 5 turns to free them. Now, both of the counters, the Devour counter, this 20 turn counter here, and the Consume counter, so the 5 turns you get once the champion is consumed, both of those get reduced each time they get applied. So the Devour counter goes down by 2 turns each application. So the next champion would get an 18 turn application, then 16, 14, 12, so on and so forth, all the way down to a minimum of 2, which is very fast. The Consume counter, or the Digestion counter, whatever you want to call it, goes from 5 to 4 to 3 to 2, and then it stops, and it will also be at 2. So the longer the fight goes, the harder it becomes to rescue the champions who get devoured. Okay, that is a big part of the fight, and that's basically what you need to know about what you want to do. But there's another mechanic that we talked about a little bit, which is when you actually bring the health bar of a head down to 0, it will become decapitated. At that point, it will harm its allies in some way. Each head is different. It has a different effect when it's decapitated. It may turn back their turn meter. It may make them take more damage. It may slow them or something. You know, whatever it is, it'll apply some negative effect to the rest of its team. And then any decapitated head will continue to take more damage. So you want to focus on the decapitated head as long as you don't have a champion who is devoured. If you have a champion who's devoured, that's your priority. Get that champion back. But if you don't have a champion who's devoured, go attack any decapitated head that you can. So it's just like a neck sticking out of the water, basically. It's kind of funny looking, but it's a cool mechanic. And then after 2 turns, that head will regrow either as the same head or as a new head from the substitute pool. You will never get 2 of the same heads on the board at the same time. That just doesn't happen. Now we're going to talk about the actual 6 heads. Again, I'm not going to give you a deep dive into each head, but I am going to do kind of a quick review of each head so you know what to look for. And I'm going to talk about sort of the major components of each that you might find difficult to deal with, so that when you start building your first composition, you'll know exactly what kind of champions you need in order to handle the heads that are present in the current rotation. So you can just click here on the boss guide and it will take you to this page. And this page will give you a rundown, a complete rundown of all of the skills of these champions. There are other resources both in the game and on various websites that you can find that will give you a more complete understanding of all of these buffs and debuffs. But you can continue to read through this. You see there is quite a lot of information here. I highly suggest you try to read through it at least once or twice because it will give you much more information than I can give you in a quick video guide like this. But let's start at the top. The first head is the Head of Decay. Now, the Head of Decay is important because of this speed of decay. It removes all debuffs from all heads, then fills a turn meter of all heads by 30. So this is the Hydra cleansing head, right? It cleanses the debuffs. However, there are 2 ways to potentially deal with this head. The first is that it is the only head that can be provoked. So if you provoke this head, it will not be able to do any of its special skills, and it will only attack with its A1 over and over and over again. So you want to consider strongly, if the Head of Decay is in the rotation, bringing a provoked champion. Remember, if you bring a magic affinity provoked champion, you've got a chance of weak hitting here. It doesn't mean you can't use it, but that becomes more RNG because 30% of the time you will weak hit and you won't even have a chance to land your provoke. So try to get at least a neutral affinity. So any of the 3 other affinities could work. Obviously, Spirit Affinity is going to be the strongest. So champion like Bivold of the Thorn is an amazing champion for dealing with the Head of Decay. But any champion that has a high chance of landing a provoke and is not a magic affinity champion is a good option for dealing with the Head of Decay. The second way you can deal with this head is just focus it as your first target, because debuffs are an incredibly important part of the Hydra Clan Boss fight. And if you can't land your debuffs or keep your debuffs up, you're going to do a lot less damage. So if you can get the Head of Decay off the board quickly, that's another option. It's not as reliable as a provoke, because the provoke is primarily going to just keep the Head of Decay on the board, but in a weakened state. And so that's actually the best option. And then you want to focus down the other more dangerous heads. Let's move on to Head of Blight. So the Head of Blight has the primary skill you're worried about here is this Poison Cloud. So Poison Cloud is a buff that this head puts on all the Hydra heads for 2 turns. Okay, now this buff cannot be removed. Okay, so that's important. You can block this buff, but you can't remove it. Okay, so once it's up, it will be up for 2 turns on all the Hydra heads. Now, what the Poison Cloud buff does is, first of all, it negates the damage from all poison abilities. So the poison debuffs you place will no longer be doing damage. And the second thing it does is it makes every hit a weak hit. And it doesn't matter what affinity your champion is. So every champion will weak hit against every head with this buff up. Now that becomes problematic again, because as we just said, our debuffs are incredibly important in pushing our damage and even keeping us alive. So we also have to deal with this Poison Cloud. So how do we deal with the Poison Cloud? Well, usually I just target this head first. If it's ever on the board, it's always my primary target. And you'll see here, this head receives double damage from HP burn debuffs. HP burns are really good in Hydra Clan Boss, and they're doubly good against the Head of Blight. So if you can get some HP burners out there and burn this head off the board, that is usually a good way to deal with it. The other way to deal with it, like I said, is to bring a block debuffs champion and make sure that you have those up whenever this blinding smog skill is about to be fired by the Head of Blight. Now we go to the Head of Mischief. The Head of Mischief is a tricky, honestly, Head of Mischief, he's a tricky head, because one of the things that he does is he has this Almighty Mischief, which has a 75% chance of redirecting an enemy attack onto another random head. Okay, so 75% of the time, you're just going to target him and hit somebody else. There are 2 ways around this. The first one is, if this head is under a hex debuff, this will not apply. So if you can bring in AoE Hexer, that's really nice. The other thing is, whether you're attacking him or not, if you are using an AoE attack, you're still going to hit every head. So AoE attacks, which are already good in Hydra because you typically want to hit all of the heads with as much damage as possible, they're also good against the Head of Mischief. The other tricky thing that the Head of Mischief does is his A1. Now his A1 attacks the enemy with the most buffs and steals all the buffs from that target and 50% of the target's turn meter. So the Head of Mischief will literally attack whoever's got the most buffs on your team and steal all of those buffs. Now that's annoying, but the bigger, more dangerous part of it is that he then applies a buff spread effect on his next turn, taking all the buffs from this head and placing them on all heads. So all of your buffs become all of the Hydra head's buffs. So there are 2 ways to deal with this. One is to create what's called a Mischief tank. So basically you have a champion in your composition that you know will always have the most buffs on it for some reason. You can create several scenarios in which that would happen, and then build that champion with a ton of resistance, because this steal can actually be resisted. And that way the Head of Mischief tries to steal from a target who is constantly resisting it and will never actually get the buffs to then spread. The other option is you can use a buff stealer. So if you have somebody who can steal or remove buffs, as soon as the Hydra boss steals them from your team, you can steal them back or cleanse them, and then they can't be spread. You can also use a block buffs debuff. If you have those up on heads, then they can't be spread to those heads. Likewise, if you have that up on the Head of Mischief will remove your buffs, but won't get those buffs. So it'll turn from a steal to just an old-fashioned removal. The next head is the Head of Wrath. Now, the Head of Wrath is the most likely head to just one-shot your entire team, or at least wipe out a lot of your champions. And it's based on his Vengeance mechanic. Now, the first part of the Vengeance mechanic is that each enemy hit received increases the Vengeance counter by 1. So anytime you hit the Head of Wrath, that counter goes up. We were just talking about bringing a lot of AoEs into Hydra Clan Boss fights because that does more damage than single target stuff. Well, the Head of Wrath is the one exception. You may not want to hit the Head of Wrath because every time you hit that Head of Wrath with an AoE or a single target ability, the Vengeance counter increases. When that Vengeance counter gets to 15, so it's been hit 15 times, it will then put a bunch of buffs on itself, but the big thing is it will counterattack the entire team. And it does this with an additional 300% damage. So it's going to hit 4 times as hard as normal, and that has a chance to just wipe you out. So how do you deal with this head? Well, you have a few options, just like with the other heads. One is to know when the attack is coming and to potentially, in fact, activate it during an opportune moment. And that is usually when you have all of your defensive buffs up. So let's say you have an increased defense and a strengthen and maybe even a shield. And then you're like, we're going to trigger it now. So we're going to get hit, but then we're going to survive it because of all our defensive buffs. And then maybe we heal up from it for the next Vengeance attack. The other way is to obviously slow down how often you are hitting this Hydra head. The fewer times you hit it, the slower the Vengeance counter will increase, and the fewer times you'll have to take this AoE hit. The third thing is you could just focus on it and try to kill it off. Usually it's going to take more than 15 hits unless you're hitting very, very hard. And again, you may want to have like a block damage buff up or something when it counterattacks. And that way you can mitigate the damage that way and then get it off the board. If you're not paying attention to the Head of Wrath, if you don't know where the counter is and what your skills do to activate that Vengeance counter, you're going to find your run ending very quickly. We have only 2 heads left to go. I know there's a lot of information here. Don't worry, you can always rewind and watch this again or go in the game and read through these abilities. There are tons of content creators out there who have done guides on the Hydra Clan Boss. My favorite is Nubraids, so I'll put the link to his channel down below. You can go check out his content on the Hydra head. He's very knowledgeable, and he's also good at finding a lot of team compositions for players who maybe don't have huge rosters. So if you're looking, if you're a newer player, if you're a free-to-play player, and you're looking for a good suggestion on maybe your first team composition, he's definitely a content creator to go and watch. Okay, but let's get back to the Head of Torment here. So this is our 5th head. And this head is tricky because every time it is attacked, it places a True Fear on its attackers. So that's bad because True Fears have a chance of making you skip your turn and losing your cooldowns. So it can be very disruptive to the flow of your team. And if you are using AoE attackers, AoE damage dealers, they can't avoid hitting this head, right? So they're always going to be hitting the Head of Torment if they're using AoE attacks. So you have a few different ways, again, to deal with this. One is to have a block debuffs buff up as much as possible. And that way the True Fears never land because they just get blocked. These can be blocked, and that is a very good way to deal with it. The second way is to have a cleanser, and maybe even 2 cleansers. So even though these fears go up, you can remove them. Doom Priest is a very good champion for this because if you build her really fast, she just removes it on a passive and she doesn't have to actively go. And then you have one other option, which is kind of like a cleanser, which is Inquisitor Shamil actually has a passive where he will remove all fears and True Fears and counterattack the Head of Torment for every single debuff that the Head of Torment places. So this is an incredibly efficient way to not only deal with the fears and the True Fears, but also get more damage out of one of your damage dealers. So if you have Inquisitor Shamil, you want to build him for any rotation where the Head of Torment is in the main 4. Our final head is the Head of Suffering. The Head of Suffering has a couple of effects here that you want to be aware of. First of all, it is an AoE A1 that can place Weaken, and the debuff cannot be resisted. So this champion can also do, this Hydra head champion, this Hydra head can also do a lot of damage to your team. One of the ways you can mitigate the effects is if you bring a strengthened buff. Strengthened buffs will cancel out this weakened buff and not allow it to land. And since you're getting hit with an AoE and you have that strengthen up, you're going to take a lot less damage. The other significant skill here is Share Suffering. This places a pain link debuff for 3 turns on one of your champions, and then this head goes again. Basically what a pain link is shared damage pool, right? So, or shared health pool. So when you hit this head, 15% of the damage you apply to this head gets applied to the champion with pain link. Okay, so the head of suffering is basically saying you're going to suffer with me. You're going to take 15% of my damage. So if you hit the head of suffering too hard, when the pain link is up, you're going to kill your own champion. Now, that's actually not the hardest thing to deal with. If you have a revive, you can just bring that champion back. But you could also deal with this with a block debuffs buff to prevent the pain link from landing. I believe it can also be cleansed. I believe this one is removable, so you could also do that. So there are actually a lot of ways to deal with this. But if it is up, remember, you want to target a different head, or at least limit your damage to this head, because you're going to be killing your own champion. Okay, so that is it for the description of the 6 heads. Like I said, I know there was a lot of information there. Take your time, watch this video again, go and read the description yourself, and then get into a fight and start experimenting so you can actually learn what the heads do and how it looks and how it feels. And trust me, once you start fighting this boss fight, you're going to learn those mechanics very quickly if like you have a second screen where you can actually look through those skills, because you're going to see them in action. One of the things I actually struggle with is visually identifying these heads. So I know what the head of mischief does, but I don't always know at a glance who the head of mischief is, right? It happens to be this one right here. I am learning, but it's taken me a while. So, you know, one of the things is they do look fairly similar. You know, there's just basically a difference in coloring, maybe a little bit in the shape of the head. But usually you need to know exactly what's going on. So if you have any confusion about which head is which or who has what skill, having a guide up that you're reading as you're playing through a practice round, remember you can practice these rounds, is very helpful. So you can see one of my main Hydra Clan Boss teams right here. Now, don't worry about the champions that I have. What's more important is the roles that I am using them for. So there are a lot of different champions that can do these roles, and I've been playing the game over 2 years. Even as a free-to-play player, you're going to collect great champions during that time. But I did build some of these champions specifically for Hydra Clan Boss. So first thing is you're always going to want to bring at least 2 damage dealers. And preferably you want to have damage dealers that can do at least some AoE. They may do all AoE, but usually you want a mix of single target and AoE depending on which heads are out there. So if you get the Head of Wrath out and you want to go single target, you can. Whereas if the Head of Wrath maybe isn't out there and you want to do more AoEs, that's good for, you know, for other rotations. So I have Ninja here who is based on, I should show you here. I have Ninja here who is based on HP burns. And he can do a lot of AoE damage, but he can also do a fair amount of single target damage. I have another damage dealer who does AoE damage and single target damage, and that is Royal Guard. And Royal Guard does damage on his AoE based on enemy max HP. So that's very powerful against Hydra, and he is one of the best Hydra Clan Boss damage dealers there is, even maybe better than Ninja for this particular fight. And because he's an epic, he's a champion that you can probably get more easily. So consider, if you have a Royal Guard, building him out for Hydra Clan Boss. My Seeker is a Provoker, so I am using him on the head of Decay, I believe it is. Yes, on the head of Decay. And he is not the right affinity for that, but he still lands it at a decent rate. And so usually if I can just start off with 1 Provoke, I can kill that head, and that's usually how I deal with it. I have Mighty Uko here, who is both a reviver for my team. He also has an AoE 1 that drops attack, so that decreases the damage I'm taking. He also has an A2 that can remove buffs, so he is a buff remover, and he can also place block buffs, debuffs. So he can block buffs, he can remove them, so he's all around great for this, this boss fight. Then I have Mithrala. Mithrala is a great defensive champion and offensive champion. She solves my mischief head problem because she has an AoE hex. She also has a cleanse, so that helps me in that regard if I need a cleanse. She also puts a shield up. She puts a strengthen up. She puts an increased defense, and she puts, I believe, even an increased attack. So she brings all of these great abilities to this fight. This is actually the champion you get from Hydra Clan Boss. So you collect 100 of her fragments from the chests, and then as soon as you get her, you can put her right back into the Hydra Clan Boss fight because she is perfect for this fight. Finally, I have Cardiel. Now, Cardiel is a great champion. Obviously, he's a Void Legendary. Most of you will never see this champion. He's one of the few Void Legos I've ever pulled from a shard. But the important role that he plays here really is that he brings a block debuffs buff. So I can have that up. And so he can prevent a lot of the fears, and he can prevent the poisons, and he can prevent the pain link and all of those other debuffs that the various heads put on my team. So having a cleanser and a block debuffs buff on the same team really solved that problem for me. I have 2 damage dealers, so if one ever gets devoured, I have the other one to help me free that champion who is devoured. I have a provoker who also gives me an increased attack and gives me a lot of turn meter fill. And then I have another champion who has a decrease attack, a buff strip, a block debuffs, and a revive. So really, I've got everything that you could possibly want squeezed into this one team. Now, you can't do that all at the beginning, but there are a bunch of champions that you could find relatively early on who would provide a lot of value. Obviously, Royal Guard is one of them, as I mentioned. You can see Seeker here is also another. These are both Magic Affinity epics, so not impossible to find, actually pretty free to play friendly. The other champions on this particular team are not, but there are other really good champions, and you can see I have them in some other teams. Here I have Ugo. Ugo's really good for this fight. I think Scylla the Drakes is solid. I don't think she's wonderful, but one of the things that I haven't mentioned yet is you can place slows on all of these boss heads. Most bosses you can't slow, or at least the clan boss you can't slow. So these bosses can be slowed, the Hydra heads can be slowed, and so having an AoE slow even would be better than just Scylla the Drake's single target slow, but I use her to slow heads that I want to control a little bit more. You can also use a Doom Priest here for your cleansing. She also gives you an increased attack. Obviously, High Katoon is that good turn meter increaser and speed increaser. I have Painkeeper for some heals and cooldown reduction. Down here, I have other champions that are dealing damage. You can use Cupidus. He's a great damage dealer. I'm using Valkyrie as a champion that gets me counterattacks. So that's actually going to get me more attacks out there and get me more damage. Also, I'm using Helicath for a block damage champion. He also gets me a shield, so that increases my survivability. You can basically use so many champions from this game in the Hydra Clan Boss. It just matters which 6 you pick to put together. So concentrate on cleanses, concentrate on block debuffs, concentrate on provokes when you need them. Maybe a buff stripper, that would be good. And then all of the other things that we talked about in terms of bringing damage, at least 2 damage dealers that hit very hard. You may be able to get 3 onto a team. I've certainly seen compositions that run that, but typically you're going to run 4 supports and 2 damage dealers, and that's the best way to go. And I would probably start there. So if you are very new and you still have, say, your starter champion up, and maybe you have an Artak who's built out, those are 2 great clan boss damage dealers. So start there and then start building your supports around those damage dealers. Okay, so that is it for this guide. Again, we didn't dive into compositions too much, but hopefully you got some tips about champions you can look for. Again, go out there, continue to do your research. There is so much more to learn about Hydra than I could cover in just one video. I will continue to put out videos on this boss fight. It's a really fun, interesting boss fight, but it is one of the most complex in all of Raid Shadow Legends, and it will take you some time to master. But before we leave, I just want to remind you that you don't have to master it to get value out of it. If we look at the very first chest on normal, here you get a chance to not only get soul stones, not only get clan gold and other rewards. Remember, you also get Mithrala fragments here, and she is definitely a top 10 champion in all of Raid Shadow Legends, and you could potentially have her in 12 or 15 weeks from now if you started on your clan boss, your Hydra Clan Boss journey right away. So remember, you only need 1.7 million, even less than 1.7 million to start collecting those fragments. And if you can get into the, higher chest here, you can get more fragments. If you can clear potentially even the lowest chest of hard, then you're going to get another set of rewards. And so you can collect Mithrala fragments a lot faster than you think. But because this fight only happens on a weekly cooldown and you only get 3 keys, it is very common for me, at least, and other players to forget you have to do it until the last day. So try to invest some time over the course of your week, especially if you're learning about the fight, to practicing getting your team composition ready. And then maybe with, 48 hours or 72 hours left, go ahead and actually start trying to use your keys. And if you clear a chest value that you think is good for you, if let's say you got 4.5 million on your first key, you're like, oh, hey, I can stop there on this key, accept the 4.5 million, and then see maybe if with my 2 other keys, I can get 2 more million or 2.2 more million to get that warrior chest. So don't hesitate to use all 3 keys to get as many chest rewards as you can, whether that's on different difficulties or just getting the highest chest from a single difficulty. That's it for me. I'm going to camp out on this page right here because I love this demon eye in the corner that's moving around. I just think that's really fun. You can see him up here. But if you've liked this video, definitely drop a like. Make sure you subscribe to the channel. Come join our Discord. The link will be in the description of this video. Hang out. We have great conversations about Raid all the time, and you can ask even more questions and from more players than just me and get a lot of good information, whether that's on Hydra Clan Boss or some other question that you have. All right. Thank you so much for hanging out. I will see you in another video very soon.